Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar with GoProposal by Sage, where we're going to be talking about how to streamline your AML compliance. We're just going to give everybody the normal 30 seconds to find their way into the room this afternoon. Sorry, we normally run these in the morning, so I'm going to say that a few times, I'm sure, during the course of the session today. But just so we can check everything's working. If you can see me and Chris in the corner of your screen and the slides, just pop something in the chat box for us. Tell us where you are today. We won't make any mention of a certain football match yesterday because we're here to talk about really exciting things around AML. But just so we know you're here and you can hear us, just pop something in the chat box for us. Tell us where you are. And I always get really nervous when this happens and nobody puts anything in the chat box. So somebody just kind of help me out and say hello or something. There we go. We're away. We're away, Chris. Thank you very much. Right, we'll get underway because we like to keep these timings nice and tight. We will certainly have you done before the top of the hour at 3 o'clock. So if you have a 3 o'clock meeting, you'll have an opportunity to grab a cup of coffee, whatever it is you need before it. But delighted you could join us. We like this to be interactive. So any questions that you have as we take you through the content today, please pop questions in the Q&A box. We'll try and capture them as we go through the session so that if there's a relevant point, we can capture it at the point that it pops into your head. So pop stuff in the Q&A box and we'll tackle those as we go through. The session today is being recorded, so we will send you a copy of the recording after the session. And I think that's all the housekeeping, so we will get underway. For those that don't know me, my name's Will Farnell. I'm founder at Farnell Clark, but I'm also co-founder at App Advisory Plus. Hopefully many of you have joined these sessions in the past, where we work with one of our app partners every month to deliver a thought-provoking and interesting webinar session. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Chris Downing. Chris and I have done a number of webinars together. They're always hugely informative, so this will be no different. But Chris, do you want to just give an introduction to anybody that hasn't had the pleasure of meeting you in the past?
It is always a pleasure. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Chris. I'm one of the directors of accounts and bookkeepers here at Sage. I've been at Sage, it's 6 years this year, but prior to that, I was account by trade for nearly 19 years. So I'm sort of been working 25 years in the profession. So when we talk about AML and risk assessment, I think it's really quite a topical subject. But also it's a case of why GoProposal. So Sage acquired GoProposal back in 2021. And really that was on planning ahead in terms of the changes which was happening in the market. There's this little thing called Making Tax Digital, which was going to disrupt, let's say, the time spent with clients, but also the need to, let's say, streamline that whole onboarding process. When you think about pricing, when you think about proposal management, it's also going alongside in terms of letter of engagement, as well as this little thing called AML. So therefore, it's a case of how do we actually provide the best-in-class solution to the market alongside all the other solutions. So really, it's a case of what we've been doing over the last 12 months or so is really building out that AML solution, but also with that, providing awareness and education in terms of how life is changing. And also what we're going to be going through in the moment is obviously how the industry is changing and also what the institutes are doing as well to keep on top of matters.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. So just as a quick overview of what we're going to cover today, just so we make sure we tick all these off as we go through. We've done the welcome, we've done some introductions. So we're going to talk about the reality of AML for most firms. So what really is going on? What are firms doing? How well are we doing this? And if we accept that we could always do a bit better, then where is it we actually want to get to? What are we striving to achieve here? We're going to talk about some of the common traps that professionals fall into with AML. We're going to think about how to truly understand what your AML processes should be achieving. There's always this kind of expectation gap in terms of what we think and what is actually happening in reality. And then touching on the value of digitizing your engagement letter process. Many of you will, I'm sure, at some point have had the pleasure of typing up templates in Word and changing email addresses and names and everything else. So we're going to talk about some of the benefits of digitizing that if you haven't already done it. As I said earlier, Q&A, this is a really detailed topic. Chris is the oracle on many things, this being one of them. So do use this as an opportunity to ask those questions to get the insights that you need. And on that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Chris, and hand over to you if you want to jump on with your screen.
And hopefully that's come through well for everyone.
Yep,
brilliant.
all
Okay,
good.
thank you. I'll just move a few windows around and be happier. Yeah, so I think before we get into the detail of AML and risk assessment, for those of you who may sort of see what's going on in accounting web and a few of the, let's say, commentators in the market, there's some really, I would say, insightful statistics shared by HM Treasury at the end of May. And I think this is what's happening, is there's more availability of data in terms of AML reviews and how many firms are being, let's say, supervised by various bodies, but also in terms of what these bodies are doing to actually make sure their members are maintaining high quality standards in terms of how they provide the AML and risk assessment for their clients, but also in terms of actually making sure that we are being as diligent as possible in terms of identifying fraud. Now, the table on the screen at the moment is from the HM Treasury report, and you may have seen in different guises, whether it's Accounting Web or other commentators. And I think what this is basically showing is the fact that the various supervising bodies are putting an awful lot of investment in terms of actually doing and performing cold reviews of their members. So not only have we got some large numbers, as you'd expect from the main bodies like ICAW and ACCA, but also there's that really big number at the bottom called HMRC. And for those of you who are not supervised by one of the main accounting bodies, you will have to be supervised by HMRC. And it's quite interesting how HMRC is the largest supervising body of all. Now, they haven't disclosed the number of reviews they performed on accountancy firms, even though they had done, let's say, for other business types. But they have over 400 employees whose sole job is to perform reviews of businesses that they supervise. Now, one of the key things from what we've seen the overall stats is the number of accounting firms being reviewed by all bodies is increasing, and also in terms of the number of wealth firms which aren't compliant. Now, in terms of compliance, I think people almost have, let's say, a green, amber, red type status in terms of they are compliant, they're either generally compliant or they are non-compliant, and we all wish to be compliant or in the middle. But actually, I think with the non-compliant side, it's a case of the institutes will be reviewing and identifying these. And obviously, this has a reputational damage to ourselves if we actually come into that view. So I think what we'll be seeing over the years is probably the institutes actually performing more reviews, not because it can generate revenue in terms of penalties, but because they're basically trying to maintain high standards. There's still consultations at the moment in terms of where AML should go. Should it be regulated by a single body or by the various institutes? But it is still a very topical subject. Will, from your point of view, are you seeing AML as a conversation point for most firms you're working with as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hugely important, and I mean, I this is the first time I've seen this table in this format, and it's quite alarming. When you think 18%, you think, well, okay, that's not huge, but it's 1 in 5 almost, isn't it? So and we've got a audience of accountants, so nothing blatantly obvious there, but it's the way you think about these numbers, isn't it? When you think 1 in 5 people are not compliant. Now, obviously, non-compliant. What does that mean? And we haven't got that. I mean, just in terms of this, I mean, we see some real kind of extremes here in terms of ACCA at 7%, ICB at 82%, and CIMA at 67%. I mean, what would your hunch be, Chris, on the HMRC supervised firms? Do you think that compliance will be higher there, or do you think that there would be less compliance?
Well, I've got no stats to actually back this up, but it's just like hunch.
I'm just putting you on the spot.
And gut feel. But it's a case of when you belong to HMRC, where's your phone a friend? And that's the advantage with belonging to an institute. You have a phone a friend. You can get some advice, some guidance, some best practice. And when we think about AML, it's not just about speaking to a client and understanding who they are and doing the risk assessment. It's also making sure you've got the processes documented, and documentation is key. And this is probably where belonging to an institute, at least you've got those starters for 10, a bit of guidance. You don't tend to get that with HMRC, do you?
No, and do we think that because I mean for me I still feel that despite everything that's going on, there's a real lack of real education.
Hmm.
The number of firms that I talk to that still don't really
Yeah.
understand what they should be doing.
Hmm.
It's like you get there's still the element of, well, I take a copy of the passport. I mean, surely that's enough.
Yeah.
And I guess the answer to that is, well, the education's there if you go and look for it.
Yeah.
But like, is there enough? I'm sure we can talk about this
And that's what we'll go through.
But it's just when you look at these numbers and you think that this is something that we have a statutory obligation now to do this.
Hmm.
Therefore, how do we get to a point where 18% are non-compliant? And what we see in some quarters is that the nature of compliance is that it's a case of, well, we've got to tick the box. So as long as we've ticked a box, we can kind of forget about it because it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And as with so many of the things that we do, going deeper with this stuff means that we have an advantage over other people that just tick the box.
Yeah, and I think just for clarity, even though the ICB number of 82% seems quite high, ICB are quite unique in the market because actually every ICB firm has to use the ICB platform. So they have visibility of every member firm. So if anything, they're already getting a glimpse in terms of actually which firms are updating records more regularly, etc. So when in terms of their sampling, they're probably sampling people which they feel may need to improve their basis, when actually all the other institutes are relying on, let's say, the firms actually submitting documentation at the right time. So it just comes down to how varied the institutes operate, and also the resources they have in place to actually perform the reviews. But also, when it comes to resources, the nature of the environment, when you've got 80% of, let's say, accountancy firms of less than 5 employees, the problem we've always got is time constraints, resources to actually keep on top of, let's say, the legislation, but also the capability of actually doing the bureaucracy and the admin at the same time doing the client work.
Yeah.
So I think it's a case of let's start diving into some of the detail, because there's a lot going on in this next 45 minutes. So I think the first thing, when people are thinking about, let's say, source documentation, validating who they are, we probably remember, right, let's get a utility bill, let's get passport, a driving license. But I think these days we're not experts in identifying what is a legitimate passport these days, can we? Because these things can be faked, and the fact that one they've gone from a red to a black passport now as well, there are changes in the market. But this is the whole point. It's not just the documentation; it's also the fact that things can be more digitally manipulated, which means that we need to basically, when we're doing performing AML and risk assessment, we need to be actually obtaining different sources of information, not just, let's say, where we were maybe 4 or 5 years ago, especially the fact there's a heightened sense of awareness as well as examples of fraud in the market. But also it's the fact that with this, the potential fraud, it's the availability of deep fakes. Now, I've used the tools myself as well and been quite scared by them. It's the fact that just for literally £10 a month, you can get a specific AI tool which will basically take a short recording of yourself, video, and completely mimic it as well as your voice. And this is why it's so important when you're thinking about that AML and that identification check is, yes, we may have actually relied upon Zoom and Teams, etc., during COVID to perform the AML. How much can we rely on that going forward? Is because the generative AI fakes are so, let's say, feel so real and so intuitive, we need to have different sources, which basically means that when you think of the data that can be manipulated, we now start to rely on other sources of information, and also background checks, which actually help support, let's say, our understanding of who we're speaking to. But also we also need to be mindful of the fact that that AML check isn't just about that instantaneous in the moment conversation and meeting. We're also going to be validating that ongoing as well. And I think this is one of the key things: is AML is an ongoing experience, not just a single engagement.
I think that's a really valid point, Chris. On one of the LinkedIn posts I did in the run up to this event, somebody made the comment that actually what they end up relying on most is gut instinct.
Yeah.
And you only get to that point when you're having the conversations, don't you? And how does something sound? Does it kind of have a feel of not being right? Because there's so much of our kind of initial reaction is based on our subconscious thinking before we start to rationalize and try and make sense of the information we've got and rationalize it. Whereas that first instinct is just us saying, you know what, this doesn't feel right.
Mhm.
And why so often our initial impression is always the right one.
Totally agree. And this is why it's a case of technology is just an enabler, it's an assistant. What it cannot replace is our intuition, as you say, gut feel, and that ability to have a proper conversation. And this is why it's probably the fact that when we're spending time with clients, it's the time which is particularly important, not just, let's say, turning the wheel, doing the transaction which is required, but having a proper understanding of the clients we're working with. But also it's the fact that we see the institutes and HMRC performing more checks, but also this is on the back of, let's say, some really quite high profile cases which are happening. So even sort of last year, there was a case of, let's say, in Hong Kong, where there was someone in the finance department who was engaging with an AI fake of his CEO, basically getting him to actually make a $25 million transfer. And these things are happening all the time. You do hear them in the media. But also it's the fact that there's even more digital fraud happening in the marketplace. And we're seeing that AI generative deep fakes are probably accelerating in ways which we've never seen before. This is why we have to be even more vigilant than we were before to actually make sure we're actually mitigating any risk to our firms. So really it's a case of, I think like everything, as a profession, we are basically the gatekeepers to actually ensuring to mitigate fraud. And this is why there's sometimes, unfortunately, or is it good or bad, probably an awful lot of responsibility falls onto our shoulders, whether that's by the institutes or HMRC, but also really we're in the best position to actually, let's say, validate the clients which we're working with, not only in terms of, let's say, to mitigate risk, but also train them with the right habits and behaviors to reduce the risk of them actually, unfortunately, doing something wrong. And this is all going around having conversations. It's also about having the right documentation to actually validate who they are. But also it's a case of actually thinking, make sure we're avoiding any blind spots or even having any biases in terms of, let's say, the relationships that we have. So really a case when it comes to AML risk assessment, yes, technology is a great assistance, but it doesn't actually replace, let's say, that gut feel which we always have. Now, in terms of digitization, I think AML risk assessment is really just one of those themes which are supported by technology, but every point of contact which we have with our clients can be made easier with technology. When you think about our time is probably the most finite resource, it's a case of how can we use certain tools to automate certain processes, give us the visibility of what's going on, but also the control to interact with it, to actually, let's say, refine it for particular client types. So when you think about that, the client touch points in terms of digital, it starts everything from, let's say, prospect hunting, the marketing of the firm, where they've seen you for the first time, that continuous engagement and retention, whether that's social media marketing or the website. Then it's thinking about that engagement, considering what services you're going to offer, the pricing, the proposals, even the AML and the risk assessment, surfacing docs from them, but also when you think about actually performing the work, how you interact and share information with them, whether that's through a client portal, whether it's e-signing, whether it's in terms of management reports, all of this processes and these touch points can be digitized, but also made more seamless. But also that's from our point of view to make us more efficient. What do our clients expect from us as well? When you think about the average age of a client is getting younger and younger, they are seeking, almost expecting a more digital experience. And Will, you've discussed this before in terms of it's the outputs, isn't it? It's the experience which our clients are expecting as well.
Absolutely. So everything is about client experience. If the things that we're choosing to do in our firm are not directly or indirectly benefiting the client in terms of implicitly or explicitly having an impact on them, then don't bother. Don't waste our time on stuff that isn't having that impact on clients. But this is really relevant as well in this kind of KYC element, the know your client, and AML is just one part of KYC. And actually, going back to that idea earlier, that if we just tick the compliance box, we're missing the opportunity. We're missing the opportunity to really get deep and understand our clients, what our clients are striving to achieve. And we look at what the financial advisor world, the wealth manager world does when they do KYC. When they do KYC, they ask the pertinent questions. They want to know from a client, how much do you want when you retire? When do you want to pay your mortgage off? Do you want to send your kids to private school? All of these kind of questions that are building that picture of what our clients are trying to achieve to enable them and therefore us, because we should be doing the same thing, to think about what are the services that we need to develop to help our clients achieve those end goals. And from a robust AML KYC compliance perspective, as Chris said earlier, this is an ongoing process. So as we understand, as we get to know, as we increase the client touch points that we have, we're going to have a better understanding of our clients, both from the opportunity to help them achieve what they want to achieve, but also managing the risk that might come with if they end up in a situation where we don't want them to be. So it's really important that we think about all of these regular client touch points and consider the know your client element of this across everything that we do.
Yeah, so let's just think about the key challenges which we're seeing in most firms with AML, and it's not just conversation. You see it online in terms of the Facebook forums in terms of the challenges they face. Is quite often the process they have in place is fragmented. They may have a client management solution or practice management solution. They may have another client list in Excel, which is basically ticking off when was the last time we performed a risk assessment. And then when they perform a risk assessment, they're actually finding time, when should I do so? What's the trigger points? But also it's the fact that fundamentally we probably feel we're spending too much time on admin. And therefore it's a case of how do we carve out that time to actually perform these tasks, which there is a legal responsibility for us to perform. But also going back to the top of the webinar here, when we're talking about the lack of clarity in the education, it's having the questions in terms of what are our responsibilities? What documentation should we be collecting? How regular should we be performing a risk assessment? And quite often it's because of changing client circumstances. Yes, there's best practice in terms of regular reviews, but also it's a case of how you should actually formulate that process or that discussion, and how do you document it? Because I think the key failing in a lot of firms which have basically become non-compliant is the lack of documentation. And that lack of documentation is probably one of the biggest problems. Is where do you start? And this is where belonging to an institute is great, because you need to say some help and some guidance. But also it's the fact that unfortunately with digital footprints, it's not something which we wish to be catching up on as well. So therefore it's a case of making sure we're doing the background work sooner rather than later, making sure we're storing it and be able to demonstrate that this work has been ongoing in the background. Because especially with the in the moment checks, which are now performed the institutes, they're actually providing only 3 or 4 days notice to actually request certain documentation. So when you think about the anxiety in terms of around a review, would we not be all that happy if we were making sure we've done the checks and balances in terms of the process? And really that falls into the frustration of, let's say, AML for a lot of firms. It's a case of we don't see it as a fee generating opportunity, because of, like everything, it's all about generating fees. But also it's a case of actually getting the right people to be performing the reviews themselves. And especially in those larger firms, delegating to the lowest denominator in the organization, do they actually appreciate and understand what's happening with those clients? I don't think there's anything else to add to this in the main priorities, is there, Will?
No, I don't think so. And it's certainly the things that I see from firms in terms of the only other one really is that often we don't see enough importance placed on AML, because it's always like one of those things, oh yeah, I know I've got to do it, but I've got a deadline over here. And then the panic comes when you get the call from the institute that says, hey, we need to check your AML documentation. Yeah. So we have to raise the kind of the importance of this and make sure that we've got that baseline. Certainly firms that I know have been on the receiving end of reviews from their professional bodies. In the majority of cases, it's been a fair process, and it is about looking at improvements. So very few people are really getting sat risks over it. It is about an education piece. Having said that, we still need to get it right.
And the thing is, it's all about having the right habits. And if you've got the right processes in place, the right systems, rather than being, let's say, a burden, it just becomes part of the process. And as soon as you start seeing the value, I think, well, you've touched on the fact that if you really have the right conversations and obtain the right information on day one, not only are you maximizing that first interaction in terms of what the fees should be, but also you're able to train the clients in terms of how they should be operating with you as well. So let's start going through what, say, a potentially a better or best situation in terms of AML could look like. And I think it comes down to understanding those key processes in terms of actually, one, having a true painted picture of who your client is and what they do. And it's not a case of actually who they are, validating where they live, where they operate from, the entities that are involved, but also, let's say, the various stakeholders, but also really understanding how they operate as a business, what types of transactions they record, how much of their income is generated from cash, how can you mitigate that, and that's clearly one of the key things in terms of actually making sure the right digital records, and also how they're actually recording financial information on a more timely basis. But also with that risk assessment, it's also thinking about understanding the money laundering aspect, but also the risk assessment in terms of actually how they may be performing in other areas around that business, because it's a case of where things can go wrong in terms of VAT compliance, but also other compliance around payroll. Therefore, understanding the whole process is really, really important. But also with that KYC, I think the KYC, as we discussed, is probably the most important element of all the groundwork around that client. Yes, we are going to be asking questions in terms of how they operate, how they perform their accounting records, who's involved, but actually it's understanding what drives them, what's important to their lives, why are they running a business. It's a case of just generating revenue and profit and cash to actually pay for the domestic living, but also where do they want to be in 5 years' time? Because that additional information actually drives the importance in terms of their character, which goes back to, let's say, that gut feel of what they're trying to perform, but also it helps us, let's say, work alongside in the way which they've probably not seen from other financial advisors. So this is why it's so important to be asking those right questions. But also it's a case of what happens when we feel something's not quite right. When we have a conversation and we feel that actually this client may be slightly higher risk, how are we documenting it? How are we, let's say, doing additional reviews? And if they do perceive them a high risk and we still choose to engage with that client, what measures and processes do we have in place to have a more constant review and documented review of that client? Which goes close to the point in terms of the importance of, let's say, having clients on digital record keeping the first point. So you have a really good monitoring in terms of what's going on. But even if they are not doing digital record keeping, how do you actually keep on top of what they're doing or maybe not doing to actually help move a client from a high risk to a medium risk? And sometimes that's involved around the habits and behaviors of that client. Now, most of this is around having the right documentation, and the documentation not only in terms of your firm level assessment, but also in terms of your processes in place when you're actually engaging with a client and the systems in place to actually make sure that when you're engaging a client, you're actually doing the KYC at the right points in time and also that review. So Will, from your point of view, in terms of your own firm and firms you work with in terms of best practice, I think that systemization is important, but also that documentation. And if you've got basically accounts on this call, if they say, I haven't really documented as much as I can do, what do you think is the best place to actually get that documentation in place?
I mean, it's going to be different for everybody in terms of systems that they're using, but what we've got to do is build this into part of our practice management solutions, whatever that looks like, and however that's working. And you talked about the challenge earlier, Chris, around kind of data fragmentation, different data. It's kind of the golden egg that we're all looking for in terms of when do we get all of our data talking together, and you guys at Sage are doing a cracking job at trying to make that happen. So I think it's about working out what the right process is for your firm. As with all of these things, whenever we're driving change, I mean, even if the institute came and saw you tomorrow or whatever, if you can demonstrate that you have a process, it's like, even if you have to say, right, let's start from today, every new client is going to go through this process. Once we've got that process right, we can then start to do the legacy stuff. We can go back to the old clients, put them through that process. And particularly if we build this into this idea of really knowing your client as well, it's an opportunity to almost re-onboard all of your clients in a way that you want to work with them going forward. So have those conversations about, look, it's 4 years since you came on board as a client. We'd love to just kind of have a chance to sit down and just collect some information and really understand where you are at the moment and where you want to go. That's a great opportunity to add some real value to your client, but also make sure that you're putting yourself in a position of compliance. But you're absolutely right. Got to build a process, make sure everybody understands the process and why it's important.
And I think, Will, you've made a really important point there, is the fact that where as a firm you feel I need to do something better, and maybe you apply a different process or a system, for example, GoProposal AML, you don't have to apply it to all your clients on day one.
Yeah.
The magic is you can apply it to maybe your new clients. So therefore you understand the experience and the benefits you get, and to just slowly apply it throughout the year over the 18-month period, whatever it is, until you feel you've got everyone going through the same system. And I think that's probably sometimes the daunting factor. Sometimes we've got this huge change we want to apply.
We do it all in one go.
All in one go. No, step by step, little pieces at a time.
Direction of travel.
On. Very much so. It's that 1% incremental improvement. Yeah. Let's go through a few sort of process in terms of, let's say, what good and bad could look like. So if you imagine, let's say, from identifying who someone is, as a case you're thinking, well, where do they live? Have I got some valid documentation in place? Is the person I'm dealing with actually on the forms I'm looking at, so whether that's digital or physical, and have I actually documented all this evidence? That's almost like best practice in terms of what we should be doing. So for example, you can't meet a client, so basically go back in time by COVID, or actually you've been engaged with a client which is 300 miles away, so it's unlikely to meet them. And this is the nature of life these days. Clients can be located all around the country or internationally. So you go for a Zoom or a FaceTime call. You ask them for, let's say, send them through proof of identity or proof of address through documentation via email or up through a client portal, obviously managing the right GDPR status. And then also you basically briefly check these results and have another Zoom call. So where do we sit in, let's say, best practice approach? So, yeah, okay, fine. I've documented all of this as evidence, but can I still really prove that they live, where they say they have? And also, have I seen the original documents? All very well having copies, but as we discussed earlier, these can be deep faked quite easily. And also, it's a case of if the person I'm dealing with is the person which I'm documented. So again, it's very easy to engage quite quickly with the client. We get them on board. We think we're doing the Zoom, the FaceTime calls. We get them to deliver us information electronically, but actually, what confirmation have we had to actually confirm all those details? Probably very little, apart from just following maybe our documented processes. Now, clearly, we could probably elevate this process a little bit more by using, let's say, some document ID checks, which could be collected through the client's passport. We can validate what's on the passport to maybe other third-party tools. Helps us to tell us whether we're dealing with real persons, or let's say in these documentation isn't fraud. But also we can store these reports digitally as well in terms of the process. So clearly we've ticked a few more boxes, but not all of them. And I think this what demonstrates is the fact that there are various ways in terms of which we can perform the AML. We may be following, let's say, a documented process, but sometimes there's always going to be little elements which may not be as strong as they should be, which means we can always be thinking about what else can we validate these sources of information. And yes, you may be able to sort of onboard the client on day one, but also what other themes can we do throughout that relationship over the next months or years in terms of actually improving our understanding of that client. Yeah. So when you think about, let's say, identifying a client, it's almost a case of face-to-face is always great, because not only are you going to see who they are and validating they actually agree to other documentation, you're also seeing them in their surroundings. How do they operate? What business records have got them? Where are they operating from? If they say they're a trading business and they're selling goods and goods, etc., can you see the stock? So obviously that face-to-face is particularly important. But also, where there's situations where you are challenged in terms of meeting them, we can actually harness technology to help validate additional sources of information. And especially with, let's say, as we've probably experienced ourselves when we've got updated our passport, there are other ways in terms of local or proper government can actually validate who you are from other sources of information. So this is where it's really important to start leveraging other systems in place to actually sort of make us ensure that we're at the forefront of actually how we're applying AML and risk assessment, and also mitigating any challenges going forward. So, okay, so when you think about, let's say, the ability of what we can do, we can use various pieces of tools, various third-party tools to help validate the people which we're engaging with. It's also a way to actually, let's say, reduce the risk when we can't actually meet our clients face-to-face, but also it's performing those additional tasks in terms of, let's say, those PEP sanctions, and also maybe bring in other electronic checks which we may not have access to. And this is why there's a whole variety of solutions in terms of your AML, let's say, toolbox, in terms of, let's say, source documentation, all the way up to biometric checks, which are basically almost like live face-to-face scan imagery of your face compared to other digital records. So when you think about, let's say, what's actually possible, let's all take a quick look. So for example, in terms of GoProposal, AML was also involved in Sage for Accountants. you've got the ability to actually make a choice in terms of the types of checks you can perform. So from electronic checks, you can perform a biometric check. So this is probably the premium standard. This covers every base, but also it's the experience which you want from which your clients would wish from yourself. So for example, rather than say share information, they'll basically get a live link through their mobile device. You have to take a short video, which then gets validated through other sources of information. But also it's the fact that reports which you then get are actually something which you can store and save, but also it's validating across other source information, various database sources. I think this comes down to actually sort of help support you and your understanding of your clients, but also give you the confidence of who you're speaking to as who they are as well. And so also with the biometric check, you can actually reduce, let's say, the level of validation through, let's say, a normal document check. So this is basically the client uploading information, whether that's a utility bill, driving license and passports, which they can do through the system. And also, I think the other capabilities of this actually reducing the risk in terms of GDPR. These documents are stored in the right way. But then you can actually then do the normal basic check, which is basically providing other source of information, which basically means you've got the choice in terms of how you would like to validate who you're speaking to based upon your own initial risk assessment of the client. And I think this comes down to choice, but also in terms of actually how regularly you want to be performing these checks. So that's from, let's say, a practical side in terms of how the software can operate. But really fundamentally, when you're thinking about AML and KYC, it's a case of ensuring you've got flexibility in terms of how you can identify someone, thinking about the system, the processes involved as a practice, try and make them as streamlined as possible, try and reduce the necessity of rekeying information, having multiple lists need to be monitored, be able to actually be, let's say, informed when the last time risk assessment was made and when should be performed. But also thinking about how are you actually performing these risk assessments? It's not just the documentation whether it's high or low risk, but also in terms of maybe the broader sense in terms of those businesses are actually performing, but also tracking what you're doing. Because obviously when you come to, and if you are reviewed by your supervising body, they would like to have additional information in terms of the regulation, how regularly reviewing your clients, but also when the client was last reviewed. So it's all about how you bring AML and risk assessment into those integrated workflows when working with your clients. Now, Will, we discussed practice management, whether it's client management. I think this is what we're seeing with practices these days, is the fact that they've probably been using Word documents, Excel files, and paper records in terms of risk assessment, AML, and now suddenly it's dawning on them the fact that these are now could be part of the integrated workflows of your practice management solution. And these are what a lot of progressive firms are now using, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the onboarding point is really important here. And I was at an event a few years ago, and a speaker there talked about the words digital disruption and what does digital disruption actually mean. And the definition he gave is like the best definition I've ever heard anybody use. And he said that digital disruption is about removing friction from the process. So when we think about onboarding, this is the first opportunity we have as a service provider to give an impression to our clients. So thinking about how does the client interact with this in terms of the AML checks and everything else that we have to do, because we want to make it as simple as easy. I had a law firm that I used regularly for things that I needed near me. And they continued to insist on sending me an email with their client care letter that I had to print, sign, scan, and send back to them. And literally, as much as I like the guy that I dealt with there, I said, if they don't change this, if they don't give me e-signature, I'm going to take my business somewhere else. And that's just like an extreme example of friction being placed in front of you when you're asking somebody to kind of commit to a long-term relationship with you, and you make it really difficult for them to do it. So it's really important that we do think about onboarding, what good onboarding looks like, what's the experience that the client gets in every step of that process, and let's make it as easy as possible to do that. So let's build it into trying to get everything in one go, so that we don't have to keep going back. Oh, we need this now and we need this now. Let's just get it right and make it a really slick process that clients are going to say, wow, that worked really well. That was really easy. So technology is going to enable us to do that, isn't it, Chris?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, if it's slick for the client, just imagine the efficiency it's going to be bringing within the practice. And when you think about scaling your practice, taking on more clients, it's a case of actually the bureaucracy and the admin just easy to perform, but it still does not negate the responsibilities that you have. Now, we discussed digital processes. Now, I think whether you're looking at AML and risk assessment, when you sit down and work out the various steps and processes involved, not only does it take time, it's also the experience of actually getting it logged and documented as well. And this is no different to letter of engagement. When you actually practically sit down, identifying scope, drafting letters, getting review, getting out the door, waiting for them to come back, just think about the downtime spent. Yes, we may have moved from Word documents to emails with maybe clever, smart tags in the documents to change from sir and madam, and then change the address and the emails, but still, it's a lot of effort involved in letter of engagement. And this is why we're seeing a lot of practices, not only, let's say, adopting digital methods for AML and risk assessment, but also using automated letter of engagement triggered from, let's say, the pricing, the proposal solution, but also a good way of actually changing those letters of engagement quickly to a more digital format via GoProposal. And I think this is the key thing when looking at, let's say, going forward in 2024, is actually how do we streamline the processes, as you say, reduce the friction. And if your letter of engagement process has any of these processes which are manual, all of this can be automated, as well as maintain that sort of high level of quality. So this is where I think GoProposal has been really championing this market in terms of the onboarding. It's a case of that first interaction with the client, thinking about the engagement involved, the proposal, what service they want to having, thinking about AML, the risk assessment, thinking about letter of engagement, that whole onboarding process, that experience, that interaction which you're having with you can be completely digitized, but also maximize the value which you have with their clients. So if you're extending that KYC conversation in terms of their hopes, their dreams, how they operate, as accountants, we can always improve that operation with this using technology and best practice. And when in terms of their hopes and dreams, it's all about guiding them in terms of where they can perform better. So it's all about how we can encapsulate that on day one. But also it's thinking about going forward in terms of when we think about 2024, how important it is to actually think about how do we scale our practice. So we're thinking about taking on new clients, we're thinking about digitizing, but more importantly, what are our priorities? And I think when we think about our priorities, we've basically got that first year in 5 years. We've been dealing with MTD for VAT, we're dealing with COVID and the engagement of that and recovering from that. 2023 was about getting our firms more organized and more structured. And 2024, a year, 18 months before MTD, if I say those three little letters, it's a case of what should we do to actually refine our practices? And really, it's a case of how do we nail onboarding and that client experience? How do you streamline it and make it as digital as possible? And as Will says, reduce that friction. And this is basically naturally improves the client relationships we have. It's all about thinking, how do we keep things simple, reducing the tech stacks which we have, make it more refined and single client lists, but also how do we build those habits and behaviors with our clients? How do you get them to engage with us in the way that we want them to engage with us, digitally, I hope, but also get them to maybe do a little bit more work themselves and not just be completely reliant on us to be doing the data processing. And at the end of the day, we're also thinking about how do we avoid technology waste. So really the key challenge we need to face this year is all about how do we control the data, have simple access to data, but also how do we systemize every process? And this is where we're seeing in terms of the market, the various technology providers, all about thinking, how do you bring all this best-in-class technology all into one place, all into one window, so you've got a single interaction with your clients, but also as a practice when you're operating, doing your compliance, you've got all the information which you need to actually perform that task in a more efficient manner. Because really, at the end of the day, when we think about the future, whether you've got MTD coming in April 2026, changes in benefits and kind being payrolled, whether that invoicing comes into the UK or not, there's going to be constant legislation change. So therefore, what do we do now to ensure that we're as productive as possible, as profitable as possible, but also making sure to deliver that great client experience? So therefore, it's a case of when we're thinking ahead, thinking about the solutions which are in market available to actually make our lives a little bit easier. Yeah. So really, it's a case of that's a whistle-stop tour in terms of what's happening in the market with AML. There's an awful lot of change, and there's a huge spotlight over the various firms being supervised by the profession. Thinking about how do we use technology to actually streamline those processes and give us a full view of our clients, but also thinking about what we should be doing into 2024. So over to you, Will.
Thanks, Chris. And we're just going to flash up a quick poll here for anybody. If you are not using GoProposal and Oversuite and you would like a demo of those products, there's a poll on the window, no obligation, but if you would like somebody to drop your line to organize a demo for you, we can get that organized. So thank you very much. I'll leave that up for just a few moments while we head towards wrapping up. We've had no questions in the Q&A box yet, so here is your opportunity. If there's anything that Chris has said that has raised any questions, pop them in the Q&A box for us now, and we will we'll deal with that. I'm going to give the poll another 10 seconds. So if anybody hasn't voted that would like to, you've got about 7 seconds left now. About 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the poll. So thank you everybody for doing that. Chris, if you want to stop sharing your screen now, we've got through that. Again, anybody has any questions, do pop them up. Whilst I wait for that, I'm just going to share my screen again here. For anybody that can you see my screen, by the way, Chris?
Not yet, no.
Bear with me. Let me come back because that's done silly things again. Share screen. We've had no questions yet, so keep going on those if anybody wants them. So if you are using GoProposal and you're not using Oversuite and the AML tools at the moment, if you want to get in touch with the GoProposal team and quote code GP50, you can get 50% off your first 3 months if you want to have a go with Oversuite to your AML and GoProposal plan. So that offer's there for you from the guys at Sage. We'll include that in the follow-up email that we're going to send around as well. Chris, couple of questions here. With GoProposal, does everyone have access to AML if they have a basic package, or is it an add-on?
Well, it's a sort of add-on. So if you're in GoProposal, there's an add-on solution which you can actually subscribe to. And I think that goes into the second question we got in terms of, let's say, risk assessment review and workflows. So within the AML package, we've got the risk review, which you can actually tailor the questions as need be. So it's quite easy to subscribe to the extra additional bits to it. But I always recommend to have a proper deep dive call with one of our colleagues to actually go through the capabilities and also really just see the wow factor. We suddenly realize, why have I been using Word documents and Excel spreadsheets to be performing this, when actually it can prompt and nudge, give you, let's say, a status in terms of high, low, medium risk, as well as give you that sort of full 360-degree review of your client base.
Yeah. Perfect. Excellent. So no more questions popped up in the box at the moment. So as I said, I like to finish a few minutes before the hour to give everybody a chance to get their cup of coffee before their next on the hour appointment. We all do that, don't we? Never build in enough time between our calls. But firstly, thank you to everybody for attending the session today. As we said at the top of the call, this is a really critical area. We have a professional obligation to do this. But it also creates an opportunity for us to get to know our clients better. And ultimately, that's what we're about. As accountants and bookkeepers, our job is to make an impact on the clients we serve. So let's use these statutory obligations to go a little bit beyond ticking the box, and let's use them to deliver value for us and for our clients. So I hope it's been useful, and we'll send a recording. So if you want to go back and watch anything, you can do that. Thank you very much indeed, Chris, for joining and sharing your expertise once again. Thank you to the guys at Sage and GoProposal for joining us as App of the Month for this month. There's another question in here. Apologies if I missed it. Will GoProposal AML be bringing in a procedures template? And also, will we be able to do a firm-wide risk review?
Yes, there's help and assistance in there, so various documentation. So, but like everything, it's a case of every institute has their own best practice guidelines. So the way that GoProposal has always operated is giving you the a framework to work with, which again build in, let's say, other areas for which institute you belong to. But again, we can go to that detail with you on a one-to-one call.
Perfect, excellent. And Chris, if anybody's got any questions afterwards, what's the best way to get in contact with you?
LinkedIn or chris.downing@sage.com.
Perfect.
So,
excellent. Thank you, Chris. So thanks again, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hope it's been useful. Have a great week, and we will see you on another webinar very soon. Thanks for joining us. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.